Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we dive into a major development in international trade, the Trump administration's decision to impose 39% tariffs on Swiss goods. What could this mean for Switzerland's economy and its long-standing relationship with the United States? Is it time to rethink trade alliances? And what role can the WTO still play in managing tensions like these? Join us as we unpack the implications with expert insights and explore what's at stake for Switzerland and global trade. My guest is Cédric Dupont, Professor of International Relations and Political Science here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Cédric, thank you very much for joining us again on What Matters Today. And I'm just going to jump in with my first question. In your opinion, what are and what could be, in the medium term, the main economic and trade consequences for Switzerland following the Trump administration's imposition of 39% tariffs, if these measures were to remain in place?
Well, thank you for inviting me again. Well, if you look from a macroeconomic perspective and the different expectation, the worst scenario would be a loss of 0.4, 0.5 of growth for Switzerland in the next year. Of course, if the 39 are applied to the vast range of products, but it's a bit misleading because already the pharma and the gold are not covered. But the worst case scenario would be, let's say, 0.4, 0.5 loss of GDP, which is significant. Right. But then, of course, more significant because it won't be spread out evenly across sectors, neither across regions. Some regions are more dependent on the watch industry or the machine tool industry, actually would be much more severely affected. So more on the macroeconomic impact, which in fact is manageable, has been managed before by Switzerland, would be the different sectoral variation. Of course, in terms of trade implication, one possibility is that many sectors that have invested quite heavily in the U.S. market or getting into U.S. market may start to leverage out or kind of hedge against the U.S. market and then would turn to new markets like the Indian market, because Switzerland has a free trade agreement with India recently. But of course, that we're not going to see the effect of that in 1 year or even 6 months. It's going to be taking more time, but that'd be quite interesting development. So macroeconomically, not a big shock. Sectorially, could be a very big shock on some sectors. And maybe in terms of rebalancing out of the US in terms of trade dependence, even though the US market, the US consuming market remains very large and much larger than most of us. So, but in a nutshell, possibly bad. I guess really it's going to be something that the Swiss industry could swallow differently for sectors.
Right. And what are the economic, diplomatic, and strategic ties that have linked the U.S. and Switzerland since World War II?
One of the myths, so to speak, that Switzerland and the U.S. are sister republic. Well, that maybe was the case in the 19th century due to, they both were federal, decentralized, and they had some kind of really strong ideological ties to economic liberalism. Lots of things have changed since then, and I think since World War II, there's still this kind of course, ideological affinity or economic ideological affinity. There's still, of course, the same political structure. But of course, Switzerland has, came out of the war neutral, not necessarily with the best reputation. Yeah. Economic ties have remained, but they have not been so tight as people may want us to believe. The ties have also been on the fact that being neutral, Switzerland has been representing the US in some countries, has been particularly the case in Iran since 1979. Right. So from that perspective, the Swiss have actually just played a role of intermediaries and served, so to speak, some foreign policy interests of the US in some countries. But mostly it has been a story of economic ties. But even in terms of economic ties, people tend to remember the tension around the Nazi gold held in Swiss bank. Also of tension regarding, of course, the fiscal secrecy and the fact that the U.S. has often, been pushing Switzerland to open to much more transparency about bank account and also on taxation, on multinationals. So what about big banks? So it's a story of tight link, but with already, kind of incident. So I'm not sure that Switzerland is closer to any Western European states. It was the case, I think, before World War One.
Right.
But since World War II, economic integration, I think, alignment in terms of democratic system, liberal values, but maybe not this kind of honeymoon story that some people in Switzerland would like us to believe in.
Right. And in this context of trade tensions, is it in Switzerland's best interest to maintain an independent trade policy, or would it be more advantageous to strengthen its ties with the EU?
Well, that's a big question. I think let's put it realistically, Switzerland is never going to really give up its independence in terms of trade policy. But of course, it depends on the economic ties that they have with the EU. And I would say that I don't really see the mood currently in the country for getting much closer to the EU. In fact, quite the opposite, which is a bit surprising because you would think that if your intentions with the US is better to be coming closer to the EU. But for some kind of interesting story, I don't really see that happening for the moment. But I think that people that have been pro-EU before are, of course, reinforced. But those that have been anti-EU, to simplify this way, are not really getting less anti-EU. But it would make sense, I think, just put it this way, the US is the first export destination as a single country. But of course, as a group of country, for Switzerland, EU is by far the dominant export market. So clearly there's already a kind of an affinity. In terms of independence of trade policy, well, Switzerland is very open, and that's the problem. It has zero tariff on industrial good, which means it cannot give more to Donald Trump and the US. And I don't think it's in interest of Switzerland to try to really preserve itself or to go back to some EU level tariff, which are not much higher, because that would hurt the competitivity. So I really don't see that happening. One thing that could happen, but really I don't think politically this is mature in Switzerland, is maybe a better coordination when you negotiate with the US. So maybe Switzerland could have tried to talk. We don't know if they did, by the way, but they apparently not. Tried really to coordinate a bit better, not to, even in terms of timing, not to find yourself alone once basically the train has left the station. But I don't really see Switzerland giving up its independent trade policy. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing because, by the way, the story between the EU and US is not necessarily foregone, as apparently the socialists in European Parliament are against the deal. So no, I don't really see that giving up. Okay. I simply think that Switzerland will have to live with the consequence of being a small country.
Right. Do you think this American decision could influence how Switzerland approaches its future trade relations with other major economic powers or countries?
Yes, I think I do see that. And I think you do hear now people in the industry or in different parties that they should take more benefit of, as I just said a few minutes ago, this trade agreement that was signed and is about to be ratified with India. There's soon going to be a discussion for signature and ratification on the agreement with Mercosur, which was concluded but not yet signed or ratified just at the beginning of the summer. And there's also still the idea to, of course, sign and ratify the agreement, the third round of packages with the EU. So that from that perspective, we clearly hear and we clearly see that it would be better to leverage out of the US market, which I think is going to be the case for most industry, maybe except the pharma, because the US market is so big.
That's right.
And so that we see coming, and I think it's a good thing. So from that perspective, it's a good thing to have this kind of wake-up call, never be too dependent on one single market, being even a dynamic one like the US.
Right. Thank you for that. And what impact could this protectionist stance by the US have on global trade as a whole?
Well, that's a 1 million question, but I think that there's different scenario. One scenario is that the US may actually push itself out of global trade. Just as a recall, it's about 15% of the global trade is due to US. So I think the 85 remaining are non-US dependent. And so from that perspective, of course, the world could go on without the US in the medium term. In the short term, that would be painful. And so one scenario is that the US, a bit like what happened in the 1930s, US basically just tried to retreat itself behind huge tariff walls for a while, may actually be thinking that is going well. But then after some years, the competitiveness will go down and then they may rejoin. So you may have, to some extent, they leave the train continues its journey, and at some point the US come back. That's one possible scenario. Another possible scenario is that you have to have competing blocks. So maybe the US is going to be able to somehow, continue to work with the EU, which is its main export, trade partner, try to somehow, muddle through as much as they can. On the other extreme, you have BRICS countries that have been so upset against the US that try to really do more things together. You have maybe some islands of countries in Africa that do them same. So a kind of fragmentation into blocks, which would be almost the worst scenario, because we know when we get into blocks competing, they may be bigger than neighbor policies, and so we get into tensions. And another scenario is that you have, so it has been labeled alliance of sovereign nations, where it's interesting, countries that want to also go toward different type of trade. So basically, it's an opportunity to really address issues that have not been addressed so far, mainly concerned with fairness, social fairness, and also environmental respectability. So that would be, if maybe Trump could be credited for kicking the whole system around and saying in the end something will come out. Of course, initially without the US, but then that could lead to a recomposition of trade. So as you can see from my response, there's multiple scenarios, and I think each analyst almost has its own version. But I think it's a time of probably high uncertainty, which is not good for trade, and that's why the perspective for growth for trade are currently being revised down, because whatever the traders don't like is uncertainty. Even if we go to the worst scenario, at least if we know it's the worst scenario, we can get ready for it. But it's one of 3 or 4 at the issue. But to think that we'll go back to the pre-January 2025 situation is probably an illusion.
Okay. And for my final question, what role can the World Trade Organization play in this context? Does it still have the necessary tools to regulate this kind of trade tension?
Well, the WTO has been challenged for already a few years. One of the challenges is that its supposedly strongest mechanism, which is the dispute settlement mechanism, has been somehow paralyzed, or at least partly paralyzed, because its appellate body, which is the ultimate body that you would actually resort to in case of appeal, has no longer has any judges or functioning on it. So what was considered to be the key strengths, and what a lot of people wanted to use the trade governance, that you could solve disputes. And of course, it has much more teeth, because you say, oh, you don't respect it, and so I'm not going to respect. And that whole thing is paralyzed. Of course, most traders, except the US, or the biggest traders, have come up with this so-called interim appellate, or a kind of arbitration system, which somehow replace it, but the US is out. So if you think of constraining the US back to its obligation, it's out of the question. So from that perspective, the WTO is not equipped to face a bullish behavior as it is done currently by the US administration. This being said, the US still has its ambassador in the WTO, just renewed it. And so the business as usual, where they discuss, let's say, not too politicized matter, is still going on. So it's hard to say, would the world be the same without the WTO? I would say probably not, particularly because 85% of the trade, which is not concerned, not directly related to US policies, is safe from that kind of practice. So the WTO still has a role. Whether we can expect it to prevent the worst from happening, I would say no. But if it could help somehow smoothen the transition to a new system, I would say probably yes, because they still have these ties, these ambassadors still speak to each other, the teams still speak to each other, still have this expertise in-house. So it's a bit of a yes and no answer to your question, but I would think with probably a less visible role and lowest expectation, but keep the dialogue, and it's still the best place to continue to preserve some kind of a dialogue rather than go to this kind of a G7 or BRICS or alternative where it's lots of symbolism but very little in terms of concrete action, in terms of dialogue on substantive matters.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cédric. This was very interesting. And thank you again for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today.
Thank you.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.